to take this opportunity to welcome all of you for joining us today for a brief historical look at the women of Glenwood, from suffragists to the silver screen. My name is Dick Ambrus, and I am the Executive Director of Glenwood Cemetery. And today we are pleased to partner with Preservation Houston to bring you this summer series. 2021 is an exciting year for Glenwood. Glenwood was chartered in July of 1871 by an act of the Texas State Legislature. And this month, July of 2021, marks our 150th anniversary, and we celebrate 150 years of growth and preservation in Houston. We have bold plans for the future for the next 150 years. And as part of our vision, we look forward to welcoming you soon to our new home, the Center for Glenwood. I look forward to sharing more about our new center later, but for now, I will turn it over to Jim Parsons, Program Director for Preservation Houston. Jim is no stranger to Glenwood Cemetery. He has developed and given approximately 300 tours in the past 20 years, and he is uniquely qualified to share Glenwood's historical past with you. Jim, it's all yours.
All right, well, thanks, Dick, and thanks to all of you for joining us on a Saturday morning. I know Zoom fatigue is getting to be a real thing, so I'm happy that everybody has taken time out of their weekend to learn a little bit more about Glenwood. I also want to thank the staff at Glenwood for helping us to develop this program series this summer. It's exciting to be able to celebrate Glenwood's 150th birthday. Glenwood's one of my favorite places in Houston, and the tours of the cemetery are among the most popular tours that Preservation Houston does. So I'm happy to get to share some of the stories with you. So I want to start today with a little bit of Glenwood history. As Dick said, the cemetery was established in 1871, and it had its first burial in the summer of 1872. Glenwood was the first rural garden cemetery in Texas, which means that it was laid out along the lines of cemeteries that started to appear in Europe in the early 19th century. These cemeteries all had broad park-like grounds and locations that were outside of city centers. And in Glenwood's case, in 1871, it was actually outside the city limits. The garden cemetery movement jumped the Atlantic to the east coast of the United States in the early 1830s, with cemeteries like Mount Auburn in Boston, founded in 1831, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia from 1836, and Greenwood in Brooklyn from 1838. And one interesting note is, in some cities, these cemeteries actually predated public parks. That was the case in Houston. So for its first 30 years, Glenwood was the closest thing that we had to a landscape public park, and Victorian Houstonians used the grounds not only as a cemetery, but also as a place for picnics and Sunday drives. And this is an engraving of Glenwood from probably the 1880s. In the last 150 years, Glenwood has become one of America's premier examples of a Victorian garden cemetery. It's not only an outdoor sculpture garden, but it's also the resting place of scores of fascinating people. You can visit the cemetery on your own. It's open every day, but I recommend taking one of our guided tours through Preservation Houston to really dig into the cemetery's history. We offer several tours each year, and the next one on the schedule is 20th Century Glenwood, which will be held Saturday morning, August 28th. And you can learn more about those tours and register for them at preservationhouston.org/tours. And I also want to thank Dick and Glenwood for their long-term partnership with Preservation Houston on these tours. It's a real treat to get to share Glenwood with folks. So today I'm going to be talking about the lives and legacies of a few women who are buried at Glenwood. And my list is going to be relatively short, but there are a lot of women at Glenwood who I will not be talking about. It's really just a question of time, and there's a little bit of thematic grouping going on here. I'm going to be packing a lot of information into a relatively short period, but I just want you to know this is not comprehensive. There are a lot more stories out there than we could tell in one program. I do hope the stories that I'm going to tell today will pique your curiosity and get you to do a little bit more research on these women and on Houston's history in general. One good resource is the book Houston Women, Invisible Threads in the Tapestry, which Betty Chapman wrote. And I bet Betty would be happy to talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A. So all of that said, let's dive right into the stories of some of these remarkable ladies. We're going to start with one of Houston's true pioneers who's buried at Glenwood. Charlotte Baldwin Allen. who's often called the mother of Houston. She was born in 1805 in Onondaga County in upstate New York, and her dad was Jonas Cutler Baldwin, a successful businessman who developed the community of Baldwinsville on the Seneca River just northwest of Syracuse, New York. And I have to imagine that Charlotte found the idea of her family establishing this trading and shipping center to be pretty exciting, and she would end up in a similar situation later as an adult, thanks to her husband, Augustus Allen. Charlotte married Augustus in 1831. He was a bookkeeper and businessman. And the next year, Augustus and his younger brother, John Kirby Allen, moved to Texas to get into land speculation. Charlotte is believed to have joined them around 1834, which was 2 years before the Allen brothers launched what would become their biggest success, the city of Houston. Now, John Kirby Allen died of yellow fever in 1838, and his death kicked off a long disagreement within the family about how his estate should be divided up. One upshot of that disagreement was that Augustus and Charlotte separated in 1850, and Augustus left town, never to return. He signed his Houston property over to Charlotte, and that property was valued at $800,000 or nearly $30 million today, adjusted for inflation. So in the last 45 years of her life, Charlotte became one of Houston's first prominent businesswomen. She managed the real estate holdings that she got from Augustus. She bought and sold property and developed neighborhoods. And in that way, I would argue that she did as much to help Houston grow and develop as her husband and brother-in-law did in founding the city. Charlotte even had her own cattle brand and ran a slaughterhouse. She died in August of 1895 at age 90, and she was remembered not only as a pioneer, but also as a kind and generous woman. The Galveston Daily News wrote, "The Allen homestead always stood open, and the hungry, sick, and destitute were always welcome, were fed, clothed, and nursed without money and without price. Its mistress was the friend of the needy and the comforter of those in distress." And that was one of the recurring themes about Charlotte, was her hospitality and her generosity. There was an elementary school in Houston named for Charlotte in 1907, which was the first public school in Houston to be named for a woman. The school closed in 2009. And the only physical monument remaining to Charlotte, other than her monument at Glenwood, is a fountain that was built in 1912 in Baldwin Park in Midtown. Baldwin Park is named for her niece, Elizabeth Baldwin. Unfortunately, this fountain is pretty much in ruins today. I will say there's been a renewed interest in Charlotte in recent years, and kind of a reappraisal of her role in Houston's history, which is great, but I really wish that somebody would come and fix this fountain. Moving on from Charlotte, I'd like to talk next about some Glenwood women who were advocates and activists in different civic and political fields. And I'm going to start with the three women that you see on your screen here who worked to expand library access across the city. As you'll see, our current public library system is the result of some pretty determined work by Houston women. Without these women, we might not have a public library or might not have it in the form that we have it today. And this is a story that I think everybody ought to know. Going back a little bit in history, Houston had a few private libraries in its early years, but the first one with any staying power was called the Houston Lyceum. It was organized in 1854, and it was a private club that you paid to be a member of, and they kept a circulating library of books that were accessible to people who paid for membership. But early on, women could not be members of the Lyceum. Membership had fallen off by the late 1880s, so in an effort to revive interest in the group, they decided to allow women to become full members. So the women signed up and really were eager to pledge their support for the Lyceum. And that's where our Glenwood women come in. So the two ladies you see here, Adele Luskin and Elizabeth Ring, were part of the Ladies Reading Club, which was an educational club that formed in 1885 and amassed its own library because they were unable to use the books in the Lyceum. In 1894, the club petitioned the Lyceum to do two things. First, they wanted the Lyceum to open its collection of books to non-members. And second, they wanted the Lyceum to move out of its rooms in the old City Hall on Market Square because they felt like it was not a suitable place for ladies to go unescorted. And they succeeded in both counts and even got the city to agree to provide some funding for the library. But it was clear that more work was needed to ensure that the library could continue to grow. So in 1899, Belle Sherman Kendall, who you see on the left here, who was a prominent member of the Woman's Club of Houston, wrote to industrialist Andrew Carnegie, who was funding libraries across the country, and she asked if he would fund a library in Houston. So Carnegie agreed to provide $50,000 for a new library building in Houston if Houstonians could come up with a suitable site and money to maintain the facility. So the Ladies Reading Club kicked into action. They invited members of the Woman's Club and three other literary and dramatic women's groups to form what was called the City Federation of Women's Clubs. And the federation, under the leadership of Adele Luskin, took up fundraising for land for a new library. They held lectures, bazaars, musicals, ice cream socials. They solicited individual donations, and they raised nearly $8,000, which was used to purchase a site at the corner of Travis and McKinney. So work began on the Carnegie Library building in 1902, and Belle Sherman Kendall laid the first brick of that new building, and it opened to the public in 1904. You can see it here in this postcard. The library is on the left, and then the building on the right is the old First Presbyterian Church. The library, as I said, opened in 1904. Elizabeth Ring, who we talked about a minute ago, was one of its first trustees. The name was changed to the Houston Public Library in 1921, and today all three of these founding women who I mentioned have branch libraries named after them. And the Ladies Reading Club, I should mention, that kind of got the ball rolling on this, is still around, by the way. It's now in its 136th year, and it still supports the Houston Public Library. And I should mention, these three women did more than launching the library. Belle Kendall and Adele Luskin were among the founders of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. Adele Luskin also became an author of Texas history and a charter member and president of the Texas State Historical Association. Elizabeth Ring, in addition to serving as a library trustee for more than 40 years, helped to establish the State Library Commission, supervised local community welfare programs during World War I, and was instrumental in getting Houston's public recreation department established. And then in her free time, she supported women's rights and led campaigns for prison reform at the state and national levels. So a pretty amazing group of women here. In light of all that, I think you'll appreciate the irony in the title of one of the Houston Lyceum's first public programs that it presented back in 1854. It was a debate, and the title of the debate was, "Are Women Capable of the Same Mental Improvement as Men?" I wish we could ask these ladies, because I think they would probably have plenty to say on that topic. Moving on, we're going to look at a Glenwood woman who was active in broader social issues, kind of in the same era that the library was launching. It's Annette Finnegan, and she doesn't get the attention that she deserves, so I'm especially excited to get to share her story. I think it is appropriate to talk about her after the library founders because Annette was, among many other things, an early donor to the Houston Public Library's collections, as we'll discuss. So Annette was the daughter of a merchant and real estate investor named John Finnegan. She was born in West Columbia in 1871, and she attended Houston Public Schools before she enrolled at Wellesley College in Massachusetts in the fall of 1888. After she graduated, which was a notable thing in the late 19th century, only a small percentage of American women had any higher education then, and I have to think the percentage of women in Texas with higher education was probably even lower. So after she graduated, Annette went to work in the New York office that her dad had opened as his business expanded. And just to give you a picture here, this was not just Annette going in and helping out around the office. John Finnegan would leave her in charge of his business when he was out of town. So she learned a lot about management. She learned a lot about the ins and outs of business, running an office, all aspects of work. The Finnegans returned to Houston from New York in 1903, and Annette and her sisters, Elizabeth and Catherine, formed what was called the Houston Equal Suffrage League. Now, that was the first woman suffrage organization in Houston in the 20th century, so the first group that was trying to get Texas women the right to vote in the 20th century. I should note there were woman suffrage efforts in 19th century Texas, but the Finnegan Sisters group, which quickly expanded to a statewide organization with Annette as its president, came closer than any previous group to actually getting the vote for Texas women. In 1915, there was a state constitutional amendment on suffrage that was supported by the Suffrage League, and it came within 2 votes of being approved. So that was very, very close. And as you might expect, there were a lot of men in the Texas legislature who were not super excited about women being able to vote. They claimed that giving women the vote would lead them to abandon their children, become socialists, and worst of all, would, quote, rob them of the modest charms that are so dear to Southern men. The Finnegan sisters, as I said, were not successful in getting women the vote in 1915, but the group they founded, which was renamed the Texas Equal Suffrage Association in 1916, was instrumental in getting Texas to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1919. The Equal Suffrage Association is still around, by the way, but you probably know it by its modern name, which is the League of Women Voters. Now, going back to Annette, her dad died in 1909 and left her in control of his business interests. Annette continued her business and activism work until she suffered a stroke in 1916, which debilitated her right arm and required her to use a cane. And she was in her early 40s at the time. So she decided to move to New York and dedicate the rest of her life to travel and philanthropy. She traveled the world, bought hundreds of items that she donated to Houston's new Museum of Fine Arts, ranging from a gilded Egyptian mummy mask to ancient Greek statuary, Indian and Persian textiles, and furniture from the Spanish Renaissance. She also, as I mentioned earlier, made donations to the Houston Public Library, which carried on a family tradition. Her father had supported the Carnegie Library Fund in the early 20th century. So Annette, in her travels, spent 2 years visiting European booksellers to assemble a collection of items from the 12th to 17th centuries that included illuminated manuscripts, early printed books, rare first editions. She gave all of that to the library, and she also left an endowment that funded the purchase of books and maps related to the history of Texas, the southwestern United States, and Mexico. And one more of Annette's gifts came in 1939, not too long before she died, when she bought and donated to the city 18 acres of land for use as a park for Black citizens. And remember, in 1939, Houston's park system was still segregated, and Annette rightly felt that there was not nearly enough parkland available in Black neighborhoods. And Finnegan Park, which you see here, is still a vital part of the Fifth Ward neighborhood today. In spite of everything that she did for Houston and Texas, Annette is often overlooked today, but I hope hearing a little bit about her is going to make you want to learn more. And maybe we can change that. Maybe we can get Annette the recognition that she's due. The next woman I'd like to talk about is Florence Sterling. She was also involved in suffrage efforts, and she built on them in some interesting ways. Florence grew up in Anahuac, east of Houston, where she helped out in her father's mercantile store before going to work for her brother Ross. And here's Florence on the top and Ross Sterling on the bottom. You may recognize Ross as Texas Governor Ross Sterling, but at the time, he owned some banks and feed stores in oil field towns because oil was starting to be discovered in the region. And Ross wasn't initially involved in oil, but I guess you'd say he was oil adjacent. He did get into oil later. He and his brother Frank founded the Humble Oil Company in 1911, and Florence joined the company as an assistant secretary treasurer. She rose through the ranks to become the company's secretary, which was a job that came with a seat on the board of Humble. That was a big distinction for a woman in the workplace at that time. She ended up retiring from the company in 1925 and spent the last 15 years of her life on civic affairs. She was a supporter of woman suffrage, as I said, and equal rights. She served as president of several groups that championed those causes, including the Houston League of Women Voters. She even considered running for mayor of Houston in the mid-1920s. One story I like is there was a reporter who asked her about her potential candidacy, and she quipped back to the reporter, "What this town needs is good house cleaning, and I'd like to know who understands the work of house cleaning better than a woman." She ended up not running for mayor, but it was interesting that she considered it. She put her views in action by launching a magazine called The Woman's Viewpoint in 1923. It had an all-female editorial staff, and it published articles by women on women's issues. Under the auspices of The Woman's Viewpoint, but continuing after it stopped publication, Florence also sponsored public performances, lectures, and debates that were focused on women and women's issues. And several prominent Houston women, including Ovida Culp Hobby, who we'll talk about later, said that those programs inspired them to become more socially and politically active. Now, like Annette Finnegan, Florence isn't widely known today, but when she died in 1940, it was front page news, befitting one of Houston's best known business and social leaders of the time. Continuing the theme of Glenwood women in advocacy, I want to talk about two sisters who made their marks on Houston and on Texas. They're Agnes Carter Nelms and Frankie Carter Randolph, and they were two of the daughters of lumber baron W.T. Carter. Now, Agnes and Frankie both grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, but it was said that their mother, Maud Carter, instilled a social conscience in them. She gave them the idea that they should use their money and their position to help people who needed help. And as you'll see, both of these women took that advice to heart. I'm going to start with Agnes, the older sister, and you see her here later in life with a couple of her grandkids. She volunteered in social work across Houston as a young woman, and she became concerned with working poor families where there were more children than the families could afford to raise. But the women of those families also could not afford to see a doctor about family planning. Now, Agnes was familiar with the work of early family planning advocates in the US, and she thought that this was a good alternative to more impoverished children in Houston, or in more dire cases, dangerous backstreet abortions. So early in 1936, Agnes and her brother in law, Dr. Judson Taylor, opened Houston's first family planning clinic, which was called the Maternal Health Center. And forgive that poor quality photo on the left, there's just not many pictures related to this. The clinic served married women from unemployed families who couldn't afford to see private doctors. And one interesting note, I mentioned segregation earlier. This was still in that era, but the clinic was open to women of all races. Now, as you might expect, the clinic's work was controversial in 1930s Houston, but Agnes and Judson Taylor shrewdly brought a number of high profile Houstonians in as board members and supporters of the clinic. They included Susan Vaughn Clayton, who was the wife of cotton broker Will Clayton, law school dean Ewing Werline, Jane Gregory Heyer, who was the wife of an attorney and the daughter of a former U.S. Attorney General, and Rabbi Henry Barnston of Congregation Beth Israel. And incidentally, Susan Clayton and Jane Heyer are also both buried at Glenwood. Now, the Maternal Health Center became affiliated with Planned Parenthood and was renamed the Planned Parenthood Center of Houston in 1942. Agnes went on to organize the Birth Control League of Texas, which helped to establish family planning centers across the state, and its organizational structure, where each clinic operated independently, but they shared best practices and information, ended up being adopted by Planned Parenthood nationwide. I should mention that Agnes Nelms and Judson Taylor also worked together on another enterprise in Houston. In the late 1920s, they worked with another family member, W.T. Carter Jr., and began buying land southeast of Houston for the city's first airport. It was called Carter Field, and it opened in 1927. It ended up being purchased by the city a decade later, and it's still in operation today as Hobby Airport. So next time you fly out of Hobby, you can think about the Carters. Agnes's younger sister, Frankie, also took an early interest in social affairs. She was one of the founders of the Houston Junior League in 1925, a women's organization dedicated to bettering the community. And it's interesting to note that the Junior League's first big project was supporting a health clinic for kids from underserved communities. So that kind of went hand in hand with Agnes's work. Now, Frankie also volunteered with local social service groups, which led her to become an outspoken advocate for minority and low-income Houstonians. She supported public housing, city planning, and better drainage in poor areas of Houston, which was an important consideration then, just as it is now. She was also an advocate for racial integration and became the first white person in Houston to join the NAACP. Frankie was resolutely liberal. She led a group of progressive Democrats through the 1950s, and her policies and her commitment to precinct level organizing that circumvented the established Democratic political machine in Texas put her at odds with old guard politicians like Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn. Now, if you've been in Texas long enough to know about Shivercrats and Ralph Yarborough, you'll kind of know the ins and outs of this. If not, all you need to know is that there was different factions of Texas Democrats, and Frankie was the head of the more liberal faction, and there were others who were not as liberal who she butted heads with, but she often came out ahead. She was elected as a Democratic National Committee woman in 1956, and she led Harris County Democrats to electoral victories in Houston, Austin, and Washington. She also provided the funding to launch the Texas Observer in 1954, and she later became its publisher. And Ronnie Duggar, who was the Observer's founding editor, later wrote this about Frankie. He said, taking into account controversiality as well as importance, Frankie Randolph was to Texas what Eleanor Roosevelt was to the United States. She was as comfortable at a precinct meeting in a black neighborhood as she was at the River Oaks Country Club. Her wealth gave her an easy familiarity with men of power, but she cared about working people, the union movement, poor people, racial equality, social justice, and peace. Earthy, blunt, and honest, she had more independent political power than any woman in Texas history. Agnes Carter Nelms died in 1967. Frankie Carter Randolph died in 1972, and they were both buried in the Carter family plot at Glenwood, which we'll be talking about next month in connection with its monument design. So continuing on, there are two more Glenwood women who I'd like to talk about who took an interest in social issues in Houston, specifically helping poor children. There are Alice Baker and Edith Ripley, who founded and supported the Houston Settlement Association. We'll start with Alice Baker. She was the wife of prominent attorney Captain James Baker. And I should mention, these Bakers were the grandparents of James Baker III, the former Secretary of State, who you're probably familiar with. Alice got involved in Houston's civic life as a supporter of the DePelchin Faith Home and the city's tuberculosis hospital. And along with Elizabeth Ring, who we mentioned earlier, she advocated for public playgrounds and recreation facilities in the city. But what might be Alice's most significant contribution to Houston started in 1907 when she met a school teacher named Sybil Campbell. And you can see Sybil Campbell on the left here reading to a bunch of kids. Campbell taught at Rusk School in the Second Ward, which was an industrial neighborhood with a large immigrant population. A lot of the families in the area had working parents who couldn't care for their kids during the day. And between the lack of care, lack of opportunity, language barriers, unhealthy living conditions, the prospect for Second Ward kids was not good. So Alice Baker got a group of women together to talk about these issues. And out of that meeting came a new organization called the Houston Settlement Association. Now, the Settlement Association was patterned after the settlement movement that began in England in the 1880s and spread to the US thanks to people like Jane Addams in Chicago, who you see here. Basically, the movement sought to bridge the gaps between social classes and expose the working poor to opportunities that middle and upper class people enjoyed. So the association took charge of the Rusk School kindergarten and built a women's volunteer corps to carry out projects in the Second Ward. This led to establishment of the Rusk Settlement House in the neighborhood, which was a community center where volunteers offered cooking, sewing, English language classes, healthcare for adults and babies, daycare services, and play activities. And one interesting note, considering that this was early in the 20th century, they even had special classes for handicapped children. The Settlement Association went on to open settlement houses on the north side and in the Fourth Ward. And after 1915, its activities were managed by the Social Services Bureau of the Houston Foundation, which another Glenwood person, Judge E.P. Hill, had founded to support the city's humanitarian needs. Now, Edith Ripley comes into the story thanks to $1 million endowment that her husband, a banker and steamship operator named Daniel Ripley, left when he died in 1921. Daniel and Edith Ripley were friends of the Bakers, and they shared their interest in community betterment. So when Edith died in 1934, the money passed to a foundation that was governed by her friends and associates. And the foundation funded the construction of Ripley House in the East End, which you see here. It was the largest and most modern facility in the Houston Settlement Association. In later years, the Ripley Foundation built even more settlement houses and paid for repairs and enhancements to existing ones. And the settlement houses grew into modern-day community centers. The Houston Settlement Association changed its name to Neighborhood Centers. And over the years, programs shifted to include things like career counseling, financial literacy, computer classes, immigration support, in addition to youth clubs and after-school programs. In 2017, the organization changed its name again to Baker Ripley, honoring the two Glenwood women who launched and supported its work a century ago. Now, the next few women I'm going to talk about made their marks on Houston through the arts, and I'm going to take the first 5 of them as a group pretty quickly because they were all supporters of a common cause, one of the oldest art museums in Texas, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. We're going to start with a name you may not know. It's Florence King Fall. And like many of the women we've met so far, she was a club woman. She was president of the City Federation of Women's Clubs that I talked to you about earlier, which was formed to support the public library. But what we're interested in today is Florence's presidency of the Houston Art League. The group was founded in 1900 to advance art and culture in Houston's public schools, but its mission later became focused on building a permanent art museum in the city. Land was donated in 1916, and Florence and Will Hogg, who was one of the brothers of arts patron Ima Hogg, led a fundraising drive for a new building, and the result was the original Museum of Fine Arts building designed by William Ward Watkin and built between 1924 and 1926. Florence helped to get the Museum of Fine Arts built, and then Nina Cullinan helped to expand it. William Ward Watkin's original plans for the museum called for a building that filled its kind of pie-shaped property between Maine, Montrose, and Bissonnette, but the northern part of that building did not end up getting built. So in 1953, Nina, who was the daughter of Texaco founder J.S. Cullinan, gave $250,000 toward construction of a new wing to the museum, and she stipulated that the design be done by an architect of outstanding reputation. So a building committee chose the German-American architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. I messed that one up. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, haven't had enough coffee this morning, for the job. His Cullinan Hall of 1958 filled in a courtyard in the old Watkin building, but gave the building a very distinguished modern facade. Mies would go on to design the Brown Pavilion, which wrapped around Cullinan Hall in the early 1970s and gave the museum its current frontage on Bissonnette. And I should note, Mies only designed 2 museum buildings, and thanks to Nina Cullinan, Houston has one of them. The museum's collections benefited from the generosity of several remarkable women, including Sarah Campbell Blaffer, whose wealth came from 2 oil fortunes. Her dad, W.T. Campbell, was among the founders of Texaco, and her husband, R.E. Blaffer, helped to establish Humble Oil. Her passion for art began when she visited the Louvre on her honeymoon, and over the years she amassed an impressive collection of art, some of which she donated to the museum, including works by Cézanne and Renoir, which you can see here. There's another chapter to Sarah's art philanthropy, too. In 1964, she established the Sarah Campbell Blaffer Foundation to expose people across Texas to the visual arts. The foundation amassed a collection of art that would be shown in museums, but would also travel all over the state and all over the country. Since 2000, it has had dedicated galleries at the Museum of Fine Arts. The University of Houston also benefited from Sarah Blaffer's generosity. She donated a teaching collection to the university through the years, and that collection became the basis of U of H's Blaffer Art Museum. Now, wrapping up our group of Museum of Fine Arts supporters, we have 2 women who helped the museum grow in more modern times, Caroline Wislaw and Isabel Brown Wilson. We'll start with Isabel Wilson. She was the daughter of George Brown, one of the partners in the construction firm Brown and Root. She started in business, in banking in New York, but she left that career to become a personal assistant to LBJ, who was then Senate Minority Leader. Eventually, she made her way back to Houston and took positions on the board of a number of charities, banks, and hospitals, and that work led her to become chair of the board of directors of the Museum of Fine Arts in 2001. During her 6 years as chair, the MFAH endowment increased substantially, and the museum acquired some 16,000 works of art, including pieces by Rembrandt, Turner, and Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, Isabel Wilson and her husband, Wallace Wilson, donated many works to the museum themselves, and they also commissioned James Turrell's light installation, The Light Inside, in the tunnel that connects the museum's Beck and Law buildings. The growth of the museum's endowment under Isabel Wilson was thanks in large part to the generosity of Caroline Wise Law, who was a daughter of Humble Oil founder Harry Wise. She began buying art in the 1950s, and she built a world-class collection that included works by Picasso, Roy Lichtenstein, Willem de Kooning, and of course, as you would expect, she had her portrait painted by Andy Warhol in 1976. She became an MFA trustee and gave the museum a number of modern works while she was living, and then when she died in 2003, she willed 54 more pieces to the museum along with $25 million. But a surprise came when her will was probated several months later. The museum was named as the residual beneficiary of her estate, which resulted in a gift that totaled more than $450 million, one of the largest gifts that has ever been given to an American art museum. The William Ward Watkin Mies van der Rohe building at the museum is now named for Caroline Wise Law, and her generosity helped make the museum's recent expansion possible that gave us the new Glassell School and the Kinder building that you see here. Now, I can't talk about Glenwood women in the arts without mentioning the woman who helped to bring the performing arts to Houston, Edna Saunders. Her nearly 50-year career as an impresario introduced Houstonians to some of the world's top performers and put Edna at the center of the city's cultural scene. And I think she really helped to build Houston into the performing arts center that it is today. She was a native Houstonian. Her dad was a cotton broker named John Wolford, who served as mayor of Houston in the early 20th century. She attended public school here and then studied music at private schools in Washington and New York, but she had no interest in performing herself. When she came back to Houston, she joined the Women's Choral Club, which was a group that put on musical performances for members' families and friends. And the club eventually decided to start bringing in visiting artists to put on concerts, and Edna was put in charge of making those arrangements. In 1917, she was encouraged to kind of kick this up a notch. So she booked the Boston Opera Company to come to town to perform excerpts from Madame Butterfly. And the second act was a performance by the superstar dancer Anna Pavlova, who you see here. The show was not really a commercial success, but it did get a lot of attention for Edna. And in 1918, she was asked to start booking events for the City Auditorium, which was the big public performance hall that stood where Jones Hall is located today. I should note, Edna's dad warned her that this was no work for a lady, but she went ahead anyway. Among her first high profile bookings was bringing the tenor Enrico Caruso to town. His performance was a smash, the show sold out, and Houstonians crowded into the streets outside the auditorium to hear Caruso's voice come out through the open doors and windows of the hall. In the years that followed, Edna brought a series of blue chip acts to Houston, including Rachmaninoff, Jascha Heifetz, the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, the Metropolitan Opera, among many others that you see here. Those shows were popular, but they weren't always box office smashes. So Edna also ran a parallel program series that featured popular entertainers like Al Jolson, Will Rogers, and Bob Hope. She promoted local and regional talent as well. She was one of the first people to book the pianist Van Cliburn before he became world famous. They ended up becoming friends, and Van Cliburn would come back to Houston again and again. Now, there's one story that I want to mention that's interesting about Edna Saunders. You may know about the episode in 1939 when the famous black singer Marian Anderson was denied use of an auditorium in Washington and ended up singing to thousands of people from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The year before that, in 1938, Edna had booked Marian Anderson for a performance here in Houston, and it was customary then for Black patrons at the City Auditorium to be relegated to the balconies. But Edna changed things up. She split the seating in the auditorium down the middle with Blacks on one side and Whites on the other. So it followed segregation ordinances, but it allowed both Blacks and Whites to be able to get seats on the floor, better seats to see Marian Anderson. And one of the interesting things, Edna and her guest, who included the mayor of Houston, sat on the Black side of the divide. So just a little bit of pushing back against segregation there in the days of segregation. Edna died just before Christmas 1963, a few weeks before ground was broken on Jones Hall, which was the kind of first-class performing arts center that she had thought Houston needed for years. Houston Endowment, which funded the construction of Jones Hall, dedicated the hall's green room to Edna and called her the Empress of the Arts. So that's a nice tribute there. Now, I want to talk about two more women before we wrap up. And these last two women are two of the most popular women on our walking tours of Glenwood. And I think you'll see why. They both have fascinating stories that are very different, but very interesting. We're going to start with Jean Tierney. Edna Saunders helped to bring talent to Houston, but Jean Tierney is kind of a connection between Glenwood and Hollywood. She was one of the most beautiful movie stars of the 1940s, but that was not the path that her family expected her to take. She was born into the family of a prominent New York insurance broker. She was raised in Connecticut. She attended private schools in Connecticut and then went to finishing school in Switzerland. And her family expected her to come back and follow a traditional upper class path as a debutante and a society wife. But Jean didn't really want to do that. The family had taken a trip to California in the late 1930s, and she caught the eye of a Warner Brothers director who wanted to sign her to a movie contract. But her dad really discouraged it. So once they got back to the East Coast, she decided to take up stage acting. And her dad said, you know, it's fine for you to be an actress as long as you're an actress on the stage and not in the wicked movies. So she picked up some roles on Broadway, including one in a popular play called The Male Animal. And that's Jean on the right there leaning up against the sofa. Daryl Zanuck, who was the head of 20th Century Fox, discovered her in the play and ended up signing her to a contract, presumably with less pushback from her parents. And she ended up starring in a series of successful movies in the 1940s and 50s. Her role as the femme fatale Ellen Harland in Leave Her to Heaven earned Jean Tierney an Oscar nomination in 1946, but her best-known part today is probably the title role in the film noir Laura from 1944, where she played opposite Dana Andrews. And some of you may know Dana Andrews grew up just up the road from here in Huntsville. There's another side to Jean Tierney's story that the public did not know about. In 1941, she eloped with fashion designer Oleg Cassini, and a couple of years later became pregnant with their first child. And Jean contracted the measles during her pregnancy, and her daughter Daria was born deaf, partially blind, and severely mentally disabled. She had to live in a home for most of her life. And as you can imagine, the experience deeply affected Jean Tierney. She sank into depression. Her marriage faltered. She eventually divorced Oleg Cassini. She withdrew from acting and checked into a sanitarium. And while she was recovering in Colorado, she met Houston oil man Howard Lee, and they ended up marrying in 1960. So that's how Jean Tierney ended up in Houston. She spent the last 30 years of her life here, and she's buried in the Lee family plot at Glenwood alongside Daria, who died in 2010. Now, I mentioned the public didn't know about Jean Tierney's personal troubles, and that's because those things tended not to be discussed back in the 1940s. You would see magazine profiles and articles about Jean Tierney, and they would include Daria, but they were written as though everything was perfectly fine and Jean Tierney had no troubles in the world. It wasn't until she released an autobiography in the late 70s that many of the details of her life became public. Now, a couple of notes before we move on. If you have taken our Women of Glenwood tour, you may remember that the story of Jean Tierney getting the measles became the basis for Agatha Christie's novel, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. And I'm going to leave that as a teaser. It's a good reason to come on our Women of Glenwood tour because it's a great story. So I will offset that by telling you a story today that you won't get on our Women of Glenwood tour, which is in connection with another Glenwood person, Howard Hughes, who you see on the left here with Jean Tierney. Howard Hughes had an eye for starlets in his days in Hollywood, and he tried to date Jean Tierney. But since she grew up rich, she wasn't impressed by Howard Hughes's money, so she kind of brushed him off. But they did become lifelong friends, and Howard Hughes ended up helping to cover some of Daria's medical expenses later in Jean Tierney's life. And finally, one thing about Howard Lee before we move on. Before he met Jean Tierney, he was married to movie star Hedy Lamarr for much of the 50s, and you can see them on the left here. Hedy Lamarr is not buried at Glenwood, so I'm not going to get into her story, but if you don't know about her, you should look her up because she is fascinating. Speaking of fascinating, I want to wrap up today with the story of a Glenwood woman who always amazes me. And given some of the ladies that we've talked about this morning, that's saying a lot. She's Ovida Culp Hobby, the wife of former Texas Governor William Hobby. She was a political insider, a publisher, a military leader, and the second female cabinet member in U.S. history. And that's really just the scratching the surface. She was born in Killeen. Her dad, Ike Culp, was a lawyer, and Ovida developed an early interest in the law. When she was a girl, the story is that she would drop by her dad's office to talk about the law and read his legal books. By age 10, she had made her way through his legal books and through the congressional record. And if you're asking yourself, didn't they have any other books in Killeen? They did, and apparently she read all of those too. She was just a voracious reader. When Ike Culp was elected to the state legislature in 1919, he took the 14-year-old Ovida with him, and she loved getting to sit in on legislative sessions. At age 20, she became legislative parliamentarian of the Texas House, and you see her here in that role. She also served on the legislature's Judiciary Committee and the State Banking Committee, all while attending college at Mary Hardin-Baylor and the University of Texas. She ran for a seat in the legislature at age 25 and lost, and that would be the only time that she sought public office herself, but she was very politically active behind the scenes. She helped to plan the 1928 Democratic National Convention in Houston and then helped to get some candidates elected by working on their campaigns. She eventually became assistant to the city attorney under Houston Mayor Walter Monteith, who she had helped get elected. And at that time, when she was in her mid-20s, she resumed a friendship with former Governor Hobby, who was twice her age and had known her father for years. Ovida and Will Hobby were married in 1931, and she went to work for his newspaper, the Houston Post. She rose through the ranks to become executive vice president by the late 30s. She was also involved in Houston's civic life as a member of the Junior League and the Symphony Committee, a board member of the Museum of Fine Arts, and president of the League of Women Voters. Now, Ovida was in Washington on Houston Post business in 1941 when the Army asked her to head up a special interest division geared toward women. The U.S. hadn't entered World War II yet, but we had just had our first peacetime draft, and the government was getting thousands of letters every day from women who were asking what they could do to help. And the Army didn't really know what to tell them because women were not allowed in combat, and there were really no other opportunities for women in the military. Ovida's work had just gotten underway when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and personnel needs became more urgent. So the Secretary of War asked Ovida to draw up plans for what was called a women's army. And the result was the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which was later the Women's Army Corps. It was a group of more than 150,000 women volunteers who supported the American Armed Forces in 239 different positions. It kind of was everything short of picking up a gun and fighting themselves. It was a common saying that one member of the WACs could do the job of 1.5 soldiers and learn it twice as fast. Ovida Hobby planned and oversaw the entire operation. She became a colonel in the Army and was the first woman colonel in Army history. When the war wound down, Ovida resigned from the Army and returned to Houston and became a key supporter of Dwight Eisenhower's presidential campaign. When he was elected president, he named her the first secretary of the newly created Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. As I said, second female cabinet member in U.S. history. As secretary, Ovida was responsible for managing government hospitals and medical research facilities, administering funds for land-grant universities, providing money to build schools for the baby boomers, overseeing Social Security, and releasing the polio vaccine. She left the cabinet in 1955 and came back to Houston, where she remained active in publishing and public service. She died in 1995, and as you would imagine, received a flood of honors, including a commemorative stamp that was released in 2011. But one of the tributes that I think is most fitting is that she is one of a very few individuals and the only woman who is quoted on the National World War II Memorial in Washington. So the memorial features quotes from people like FDR, Truman, George Marshall, MacArthur, and then there's this quote from Ovida. Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation, not as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I'm going to ask Dick to come back on here for some words about Glenwood's future before we get to the Q&A. So Dick, if you're out there.
I'm here.
Hey, he's not even asleep. This is good.
No, that was a fantastic presentation, Jim. Thank you. I want to introduce a new topic from what Jim has been talking to us about. And it starts with about 5 years ago, our board charged a building committee to address the vision and plans of Glenwood for the future. And through that planning process, the board agreed to move forward with a new Center for Glenwood that would be a primary gathering place for families and friends of Glenwood, as well as a resource for the community. They envisioned a place to host education seminars, conduct historical and horticultural research, and serve as an archive for some of Houston's most notable people. As part of this process, it was necessary to look at our existing situation. And it was decided that the best location for the new Center for Glenwood was where our existing maintenance facility was located. So plans were developed to move our maintenance facility behind the postal maintenance facility. And this is to the west of our existing entryway. The new maintenance facility is state of the art. It encompasses about 1.2 acres of land area and about 13,000 square feet of covered maintenance buildings. It also provides sufficient parking to take overflow parking from our new center that's shown on the screen right now. As a matter of information, the existing entryway is going to be abandoned and moved about 60 feet down to the east on Washington Avenue. And the main reason for doing this is to provide for a more expansive entry way into Glenwood, and it makes better land use capabilities in doing it this way, and it also brings the new center into focus. 14,000 square feet, and includes such things as a seminar room with kitchen facilities, an archive and genealogy room, and a large reception area and adequate parking in front of the center, as you can see there. To pay for this, a $15 million capital campaign was formed to raise money for the new center. And to date, our capital campaign has motivated people to give over $10.5 million. And we will be breaking ground hopefully this fall. But we still need support. We need your support. And I would invite you to visit our website or call to learn more about how you might get involved. We have several ways to recognize our generous donors, and we welcome you to take advantage of this lifetime opportunity that will be recognized in perpetuity. In the meantime, thank you for joining us today. Jim, you did a good job I will be pleased to answer any questions you have during our question and answer session. Now I'm turning it back to you, Jim.
All right. Well, thank you, Dick and Betty. Well, let's have you come on if you would, and everyone, we will be happy to take your questions now. So as a reminder, you can use the Q&A feature there. Look for those two speech bubbles, and you can type in your questions related to anything I said, related to Houston women, related to Glenwood. We would love to get those questions and to answer those. Let me introduce Betty Chapman. I've mentioned her, and we're so happy that she can be with us today. Betty, as I said, is the author of Houston Women, Invisible Threads in the Tapestry. She's also written extensively about Houston's history for the Houston Business Journal and has contributed to other books. She is a longtime member of Preservation Houston, longtime member of the Heritage Society, a member of the Ladies Reading Club, which we have a question about, Betty, and is really the Babe Ruth of Houston women's history. So we're so happy that she can join us. I feel like I have been playing stickball for 45 minutes, and now I'm going to watch Babe Ruth come in and knock one out of the park. So not to put any pressure on you, Betty, but
Babe Ruth has aged a good bit in those years, so we will see. We will see.
I bet Babe Ruth still got it. We will kick off actually with a question about the Ladies Reading Club, because that was the first one to come in. Since you're a member, Betty, can you talk a little bit about what the club does today?
Yes, the club was always, in the beginning, they gave papers, and that's why they were so lacking a library where they could do their research. And today they do programs, but they do many with issues today and current things that are going on. And they are a very strong supporter of the Houston Public Library and make a gift every year to the library. So the library is very much the focus of what they do. Reading, having libraries and supporting them are certainly an enrichment for the community.
It's nice to know that they've carried on all this time. Do you know, Betty, what the status is of any of those other women's clubs that were part of the City Federation?
Oh yeah, there were only 5. There were 5 that formed in the beginning. The Women's Club was one, and it is still in existence today. They were the ones that started the first free kindergarten for children, which was became part of the Settlement Association. And then there was really probably some names that no longer exist. There was a Shakespeare Club, Ladies Shakespeare Club. They were one of the 5. The Mansfield Drama Club, which actually had some male members, was part of it. And then the Current Literature Club. So there were 3 what were considered literary clubs for women. The Ladies Reading Club was the most restless one, though, because they presented the programs, did the research on rather weighty subjects, and they were the ones that really were pushing for the library. But actually, the City Federation was formed by those 5 groups, and they were the ones that initiated the work in finding a site for the library. And then, of course, Belle Kendall writing Carnegie for building. So yeah, women were not largely activists like that, because women were not supposed to do that. You know, women were to be the homemakers, the mothers, the wives, and could do things that did not require any kind of legislation, could not do anything that required any kind of legislation. So this was one of the first real activist moves we see on women in Houston, that they just were not going to sit around and not get this library.
I think it's interesting when you look at this group and then you think about women who we didn't talk about today, but there were a lot of, especially when it came to educational issues and social issues in the city, they were not willing to accept the status quo. They were really going to go out and push for betterment as they saw it. And you know, without these ladies, we wouldn't have a lot of the institutions that we have today.
Well, you know, the beginnings of the Museum of Fine Arts started with a group of women wanting art taught in the schools because they thought this was a valuable part of learning that children were not experiencing. So they formed the Public School Art League. And that was the official group that started. The MFA credits their founding in 1900 to this group. And it was just really unusual. So they needed to raise money in order to buy the artwork to take into the schools for the children to learn from. So Mrs. Cherry, Emma Richardson Cherry, was an artist who was a part of this group. And she said, I can remember sitting down in front of Levy Brothers with my tin cup taking money. So they were willing to do that in order to raise money. And they were small steps they took until they could really take larger ones. But they were willing, they knew they had to get something done. And of course, the big thing was, at that point, women did not have a vote. So they were not going to be able to change anything that would take a vote to legislate, to determine a library in the city, because they couldn't even vote in local elections. And so, of course, finally getting the vote helped them do larger things. But interestingly enough, it was always done through an organization. So I think that is why women became so influential in the early 20th century, is that they formed groups. Women are great collaborators at having dreams and then sitting and saying, okay, how can we get this done? And so the club movement was very, very important in advancing women's lives and particularly their involvement in the community.
I think so. We've had a couple of where are questions. One is, where can you purchase Betty's book? And the answer is, I think it's out of print. Is that right, Betty? But it's available from used booksellers.
It is out of print. I have bought used copies from Amazon.com. Mm-hmm. I bought several that I had signed to somebody inside when I saw it. And but I thought I'd give it to my granddaughters. That won't matter. And then I thought, oh, they got rid of the book. They didn't keep the book. They sold it. And that's okay. I'm book heavy too, so I do understand that. I bought one day at secondhand books. That's not the name of it, but anyway.
Oh, half price books? Half price?
Yeah, half price books. I found one when I was
I think that's where I got mine.
I was browsing in there one day, but I do think they are still available, particularly the used ones, which have never looked like they've never been opened, so they're okay. You can get from Amazon.com. And there might be other places, but no, it is out of print. It is out of print.
The other where question is where do we find all the women who I talked about today? And it's an easy one. They're all at Glenwood, not necessarily together at Glenwood. They're scattered around, but we talk about many of them on our walking tours. And if you want to find any of these women in particular, the staff at Glenwood in the office will be happy to help you pinpoint exactly where they are in the cemetery. And Dick, that leads me into a question about Glenwood, because we talked about a handful of women who are buried there, but we have a question about how many people are at Glenwood in total.
In total, there is a little bit over 25,000 burials here in Glenwood. And that includes Washington Cemetery also. Actually, it breaks down to about 18,000 in Glenwood and 7,000 in Washington Cemetery, in that range.
And while we're mentioning Washington, do you want to talk briefly about Washington?
Well, I might just say that Washington Cemetery was, and with it came a small endowment and about 7.5 acres of undeveloped property, which is like gold. When you're talking about a cemetery, particularly one that's so close to downtown. And we began maintaining it for a group in 1995. And then it was decided that in 1999, they wanted to get out of the cemetery business. And we were next door, so we kind of merged the operations together. And I think it's been very, very successful.
And Washington's fascinating on its own. We focused on Glenwood today, but there are some really interesting stories across not across the fence. There's no fence anymore, but across the imaginary line in Washington too.
I had an interesting. Oh, excuse me. Go ahead, Jim.
No. After you, Betty.
Oh, well, I was going to insert something about what really got me started looking at cemeteries was looking for the women who lived in the houses down in Sam Houston Park that the Heritage Society administers. I was asked to find information on these women because in some cases we did not even know the woman's first name, and we'd give tours. We'd just call her Mrs. whatever she was. So I began looking, and I found, I had one experience that was really wonderful. I knew where Mrs. Noble was, whose home is the oldest structure we still have left in Houston and where she taught school, because her family died during the 19th century, and they were all buried at Founders, the old cemetery over on West Dallas. So when Glenwood was first chartered, she realized there was not going to be any room for her at Founders, and she bought a lot right then just for herself. I knew where, I had found her because I had gone to the cemetery because I wanted to find where all of these women were buried. And another one I had searched for was Margaret Vermond Rice, who was the widow of, the wife of William Marsh Rice, died during the Civil War and had been buried in the Episcopal Cemetery, which was a part of what is today Sam Houston Park. But that had been deconsecrated, and they had said so many of them had been moved to Brooks that I could not find Margaret Rice until I visited Mrs. Noble's grave, and I walked right by the Vermond. They're right next to each other, family, and there is Margaret. She is buried with her Vermond family. And so I thought, oh, that is wonderful. I'm so glad these two women are together here. Because of those experiences. So that is something, and there are 8 of the women who's lived in some of the houses in Sam Houston Park that are buried at Glenwood. The majority of them certainly are buried at Glenwood. And so that is an interesting thing too.
Well, in talking about the houses at Sam Houston Park, one of the interesting Glenwood connections there is the Nichols Rice Cherry House, where Margaret Vermond and William Marsh Rice lived, was later sold by Annette Finnegan. Is that right?
Absolutely. The Finnegans really were not discussed early, back when I took docent training in the 70s, as being even an owner of the house. But they had rented it, John had rented it, and then they lived in it at least a year before they moved to New York. And then there was the Evershade family, was the one that was living in it during that time. In New York, the house had been moved. We're good at doing that. At least it hadn't been torn down. Had been moved down a block from its original position across from the courthouse. And it was going to be torn down for a commercial building. And the Finnegans thought, well, I guess this is inevitable. But Annette was in New York working in her father's office. And she said, let's see if we can just put the house up for sale. Somebody might buy it and move it, and that would save it. So I do think that was Annette's decision. We got it. We really know the source of that. And who came and bought it? But Emma Cherry and her husband. They only paid $25. They just really wanted the surround of the front door, but they took the whole house, moved it to a lot in Montrose. But what I find so fascinating there, see, I love to find connections between these women, is that Annette Finnegan is considered the first significant donor to the Museum of Fine Arts, because she ultimately in those years sent back over 600 items, not that they're all still there, but she is considered the first significant donor. And Emma Cherry is considered a founder because she was the one that instigated the Public School Art League those years. So I love the connection between Emma Cherry and Annette Finnegan there.
That's a great one. I like that too. It's interesting to see the connections between anybody and anybody in Houston. We think of it as such a big city, but for so many years it was not a big city. And if you were doing something, then chances are you were going to be connected to someone else who was doing something. We have a viewer who just checked, and there are 11 copies of your book, Betty, in the Harris County Public Library system. So if you have a county library near you, you can check one out. I'm sure Houston Public Library also has it.
When the book was published by the Houston Junior Forum, at least they came up with the funding to do the book, and they are celebrating their 75th anniversary this year. And they were very involved in the neighborhood centers for years. I worked did service in a preschool on Canal for the Houston Junior Forum when it was working with neighborhood centers. But anyway, they are I've really forgotten the trail I was going on here. I don't know. I get so excited about finding things that match here. And so anyway, maybe I've said enough there.
Dick, we got another cemetery related question for you. Is Glenwood full, or is it possible to still get property there?
We have approximately 60 years worth of sellable inventory left based on our current attrition rate. And it's at least that. So the answer to that is we're not full. We have plenty of property to show people. And go ahead.
You said 60 years. I think your audio cut out there briefly.
We have approximately 60 years of inventory left to sell
Okay.
based on our current attrition rate. And that's conservative. So it's probably a little bit longer than that. But we're not full by any means.
All right. And Dick would be happy to show you some of the available property.
Come
That's right. If you like what you see. We've had a question about the walking tours, which I can help with. Preservation Houston offers 4 public walking tours of Glenwood every year. And the next one we have coming up is going to be August the 28th, which is 20th Century Glenwood. And then we have one the Saturday after Thanksgiving, whatever the date is there, late November, which is Historic Glenwood Cemetery Part 1, which is focused on Houstonians who were prominent before oil was discovered. So we take the cemetery and divide it up into different topics. We have 5 different tours that we do at Glenwood because there's just too much to talk about on any one tour. So please do look those up. You can visit preservationhouston.org or glenwoodcemetery.org to find information about the tours, and we would love to see you on one of those. Dick, got another question for you here that I'm going to follow up with a question for Betty. Dick, someone is asking, this may be a tough one. I'm really going to put you on the spot. What's your favorite plot at Glenwood?
Oh,
Not going to offend anybody there.
somebody wants to get me in trouble. There's several, but I think the McNair lot is to me, is one of the very appealing lot. The Reed lot, which is across the street, very elegant. The Farm lot, magnificent. There's just there's just too many for me to say one is the best, but I do like the McNair one.
The McNair one is a pretty one, and that's a more modern one. That one was built within the last few years, wasn't it?
Right. It's constructed out of hill country stone. Got a huge cross that is carved out of hill country stone. So it's just a beautiful lot, and it's in an area that is set into the side of a hillside, and it's just a beautiful setting, I think. But there are many other properties in Glenwood that approach that, and the Robertson lot. I mean, I could go on and on. There's just so many different properties that have real appeal to them.
Well, that's a diplomatic answer, and it's hard to come up with anything because everything out there is beautiful. So it's tough to play favorites. We have a question that is: are there foreign women buried in Glenwood? And I think the short answer is yes, because there were different immigrant groups who came to Houston. It can be, yeah.
We have a lot of nationalities that are buried here in Glenwood, and particularly over the last 20 years, we've have had a lot of Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Indians. There's been an explosion, I think, of foreigners who have resettled in this country and are buried here in Glenwood. So, and that's become more popular, I guess, during the last 20 years. Like, when I first started,
there's some really interesting. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say when I first began here in Glenwood about 38 years ago, you know, there was, we didn't have that kind of activity going on. And over the years, it's progressed to where we're getting more and more people that are purchasing property here in Glenwood and being buried here. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, kind of reflects Houston there. Betty,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you. This is a question from me.
Oh goodness,
If you,
I can't answer your question.
yes, you can. I know you can do this one. If there was a woman who you would add to the list of women that I talked about at Glenwood, who would it be? Someone I didn't talk about.
Okay, I did think about some of those. I don't know that I can think who might be the most significant. One woman was Margaret Kincaid, and because we still have Kincaid School, that is a very familiar name. And Margaret Kincaid was a teacher, loved her teaching. This was around the very late 19th century. And then she married, and the Houston school said, no, you can't be married, you have to quit teaching. And that was actually a rule in HISD then, but in the schools until the early 1940s. Well, she was devastated that she couldn't teach school, so she started teaching in her house, and very successful. She had students. She also had 2 children, and she decided she needed more room, so they just took the roof off the house, added a 2nd story, and she kept teaching. Finally, of course, that was not sufficient, and then they made the first move over to Richmond and bought a school, and then, of course, they are located today out in West Houston. But I think Margaret Kincaid showed real innovation, but the fact that she couldn't teach while being married just tells you so many restrictions women had. Their hands were really tied in doing so many things. Well into the 20th century too. But I think that is an interesting story, that she is really part of our educational history here. The first woman doctor I also found interesting, because I had never realized we had one here by 1871. And I stumbled on Dr. Margaret Holland's gravesite, and I thought, oh my goodness, I think I read somewhere her name. And so then I really got busy learning about her. And she was a graduate of a women's medical school in Chicago that early, which is almost unheard of. And that might make her the first doctor in Houston, but I haven't seen that as an actual female doctor, but I haven't seen that as anything. But she did practice medicine, and but she was also very involved in the community. She was one of the first presidents of the public school art league. She had no children. She never married, but she really supported education. And I understand from reading about her that she educated a number of young people here in the community who otherwise would not have been able to have received the education that she provided for them. So Dr. Margaret Holland, whose name was really foreign to me for many years because I never read anything about it, never saw her, but she is at Glenwood, and I think that's very, very significant too. Alone, I don't think she ever had any family here except a couple she knew, and she was their private physician, which is really what brought her to Houston.
Well, we may have to.
There are a lot of others too, but yeah, there are just so many stories about all these women at Glenwood.
Well, we may have to look into adding some of these women to our tours, and there are a lot of women on our tours who I didn't talk about today too. So there's a lot more to learn. I will read one comment that's come in, and then we can close. Sylvia Hinckley mentions she doesn't know if any of the women who started this are buried at Glenwood, but there chances are that they are. One women's organization that started in the early 1920s and is still active is the Charity Guild of Catholic Women. It founded the Mexican Free Clinic that's now known as San Jose Clinic, the oldest operating charity clinic in the United States. And there were 59 founders, and I would agree with Sylvia, there's a good chance that some of those 59 are at Glenwood. So we may have to do some digging on that one as well. Well, we should probably bring this on home. Is there anything, Dick or Betty, that y'all would like to add before we close?
I want to thank you. This was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful experience, and a learning experience, even for me. And I just want to thank you so much for doing it. And because it does bring women into the limelight. of what they've done, which we are still not terribly knowledgeable about everything women have done. So thank you for doing this, Jim.
Oh, I'm glad to do it. And thank you for.
And yes, to Glenwood. And of course, this is very exciting, everything that's happening at Glenwood, and a very significant anniversary for them.
Dick?
It is. Jim, I'd just like to thank those who we can't see that are listening in on us for taking the time and the opportunity to listen to our program. Jim, I thought you did an excellent job. Betty, same there. I just want to extend my thanks to everyone for putting this together, and I look forward to the next two series that we'll be having.
Well, thank you. And yeah, everybody, remember, if you haven't signed up yet, our next program will be Art for the Ages, which will look at the monuments of Glenwood, and that will be coming up in late August. And then we'll have Glenwood in the oil field in September with some interesting stories about the wild and woolly Houston oil men. So we have a lot to look forward to. Thanks again for joining us, and hope that we'll see you all again soon.
Goodbye.
Enjoy your weekend, everybody.